Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with another episode of Way of the Underhive. This series is dedicated to helping brand new players to Necromunda build their starting rosters and learn more about the game mechanics of their favorite gangs. And on today's episode we will be discussing Wyrd Powers introduced by the various editions of Necromunda. We'll discuss each Wyrd Power in detail, give our thoughts of the abilities, and explain how it can be used to help you to achieve victory in your next battle report. So these next few series of videos, we're going to get kind of weird. We're going to be talking about Psykers and their roles in Necromunda. We'll also give you a little bit of a briefing of what the Psyker rules detail in this game setting. We'll also talk about in quite a bit all the Wyrd powers that are available in Necromunda as well. We'll talk about each one of those individual abilities and how best to use those in your campaigns and as well as your games on the tabletop. We'll also provide our conclusive thoughts on what we think about this Wyrd power set. And because this video will be a little bit more of a deeper dive, I will put timestamps in the description box down below so that way you can click and navigate to the part of the video that interests you the most. So that being said, let's talk about Wyrd powers. Alright, so give you the rundown real fast of Psykers and Necromunda. First of all, willpower characteristic is going to be key because the lower the willpower score is for your character, the easier it's going to be for them in order to trigger these mental abilities off. Think of it, you basically take 2d6 and you got to either match or beat the willpower score for your character. Now, about a 7+ willpower is going to basically give you a 50-50 odds of whether you can get your Wyrd powers off or not. You want to be more like in the 6, the 5, the 4 levels, so that way you can continually get your Wyrd powers off, statistically speaking, at a higher level. And of course, if you can't get that low with your willpower scores to either upgrading your character, you could also do so with some very simple actions you can take in the actual tabletop to help you. For example, every single one of these characters do come with the power called Maintain Control. It is a simple action and it's used for continuous effect Wyrd powers that you might use. All you gotta do, of course, is take a willpower test with a 3+ modifier attached to it. If you manage to beat that score, of course, the ability still keeps on going, otherwise it immediately ends. At the same time, if you do need a little bit of boost to your willpower test, you can take a concentrate action with your Psykers, and what that basically is a basic action that adds +1 to your willpower test the next time you roll it. At the same time, you do have to watch out for Perils of the Warp. If you manage to roll Snake Eyes when you roll for your powers, there's a couple of bad things that can happen to your characters, kind of like miscasting for your magic in Warhammer the Old World. At the same time, if you have rival Psykers in the opposing gang, of course, all they gotta do is roll 2d6 as well and beat your willpower test. And they're able to do so, that means they disrupt your power and your ability doesn't go off either. Now, when it comes to the Perils of the Warp, however, like I said before, double ones is the way you actually trigger that event, and it could actually be quite devastating for your Psykers. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here in a second. Lastly, you have two types of Psykers in your gangs. You have a sanctioned Psyker, which is nice because you get to reroll 1 willpower test per battle, which could be extremely useful. Having that ability to reroll could prove quite critical if a situation warrants it. Also, you have for most of your fighters, you'll have what's called the non-sanctioned Psyker special rule, which means if your character gets taken out of action, your opponent earns D3 times 10 credits in order to do so, because they're wanted, dead or alive, basically. And if they get captured, they can be immediately sold if captured as well. So you won't be able to get them back in a rescue mission if that does happen. And lastly, the coolest thing about these game mechanics, of course, is your Psyker's ability to access force weapons. Force weapons are actually just normal mundane melee weapons, but if a post-battle action where you do a sign attunement, if you actually pass that roll, you could actually add the power trait as well as a sever trait to your force weapons, and that only works in the hands of a Psyker. So for those of you guys who are looking for some ways to make your Psykers even deadlier, may I suggest giving them force weapons. Alright, so let's talk about Perils of the Warp. Whenever you roll double ones or a double 6 when making a willpower test to perform a Wyrd power action, you might actually get the Perils of the Warp, right? So let's go and talk about that ends up being. You end up rolling a 2d6 and you get one of basically 5 possibilities. If you roll a 2 to 3, you get what's called a tear in reality, and what that rule states is that the Psyker loses control and warp energy tears reality apart around them. Center a 5-inch blast marker on the Psyker. Any model touched by the marker must pass a willpower test or lose a wound or suffer driver wounded effect, and the Psyker then goes out of action. On a 4 through 5, you have the Immaterium inverse. The warps inverts upon the attempting to control it, the Psyker becomes a target of power regardless of range. If the power is beneficial, the Psyker instead becomes prone and pinned and suffers a strength 6 hit that inflicts 2 damage. Ignoring armor saves, and the power has no further effects. On a roll of 6 or 8, you get Whispers of the Warp. The Psyker's mind is filled with screaming demonic voices. The Psyker becomes subject to the Insane condition. Place a sanity marker on the Psyker's fighter card and roll d6 on the Insane table when they activate. On a 9 through 10, you get Warp Surge. The Psyker's power becomes overcharged with warp energy. The Psyker may immediately try to manifest the same power again as a free action, or if they're trying to disrupt the power, they may immediately manifest one of their own powers as a free action. This additional manifestation of the power can trigger Perils of the Warp as normal. After working out the effects of the power, the Psyker becomes prone and pinned and suffers a strength 4 hit, which inflicts 1 damage. And lastly, from 11 through 12, you have Demonic Possession. Demonic energy courses through the Psyker's body. The Psyker increases their movement, strength, toughness, as well as attack characteristics all by 3, and their weapon skill to 2+. The unarmed attacks inflict 2 damage and have an AP of -1. In the end phase of the following round, or if the Psyker generates this result again, they go out of action. So as you can see, some pretty crazy things can happen with Perils of the Warp as well. It triggers either on a double 1 or a double 6 when you actually try to do willpower tests before weird power, or when attempting to disrupt a weird power. So psychic abilities are quite nice, but player beware, there are some consequences if you mess up. Now, before we actually get into the psychic abilities, the first thing we're going to talk about is the Genestealer Psychic Familiar, which is an exotic beast that you can take for your Genestealer cult gangs. The stats on these things aren't really all that impressive, but what's so great about the Genestealer Psychic Familiar is that it only costs 25 credits, and you can take 2 of these for both your leaders as well as for your champions. And the reason why you want to have these Genestealer Psychic Familiars is because of the Omen of Fortune special rule. How that special rule basically operates is that every single time your leader or your champion takes a hit, you can take a willpower test. And if you pass that willpower test, you ignore the hit. And you can take up to 2 of these psychic familiars per leader and champion, which is great because that means that every single time your leaders and champions get shot at, you could just ignore 2 of the hits if you take a willpower test and pass it. And at willpower 5, your adept is going to be dodging most of the hits that are coming their way. Now, unfortunately, they're not as good as the Chaos Hellot Familiars, because Chaos Cult Hellot Familiars can allow you to reroll willpower tests for psychic abilities as well, so they can't do that, but they can keep your Adept and your Psyker alive for much longer, so I always suggest taking the max number of these Genestealer Familiars for each one of your leaders. So let's talk about the Genestealer Cults Wyrd Powers. So they're mainly an offensive discipline, which requires your Adept or your Psyker needs to be within enemy striking distance in order to use it. Now your powers are pretty short range, about 9 inches is pretty much where you're kind of operating at, so you're going to have to equip your Psyker accordingly in order to protect themselves. So they'll need some kind of weaponry, like a close combat attack or maybe like a short range shooting attack to protect themselves. You also want to make sure they have some kind of armor in order to protect themselves as well. Unfortunately for this weird power, there is no special ability for it because it's not technically a psychic discipline. It's just a list of weird powers that your Genestealer cultists can actually use, so that part is quite regrettable. Hopefully in the near future, when they start releasing more supplements to Necromunda like they did for the Ashways Nomads and for the Ironhead Squad Prospectors, hopefully they'll do one for all the cults, in which case hopefully they'll kind of fix this ability. Alright, so power number 1 is from the Telepathy discipline. It's called Hypnosis. It's a basic action to cast this ability, and the rules read that with little more than a piercing stare, the Adept can dominate the minds of the weaker willed. Select an enemy fighter that is both within 9 inches and line of sight of the Adept, and that has not been activated this turn. If the willpower test to perform this action is successful, that fighter may only perform a single move simple action when activated this round. Now, it's a pretty nice, decent control ability to prevent enemies from charging against your Psyker, which is quite nice about it. However, though, there's 2 things that are really wrong with it. The first thing is that it's the really short distance, which is 9 inches, alright? If your Psykers are within 9 inches of anything, chances are they'll probably get charged at in most cases, because not only do characters have like really good movement allowance and D3 inches to their charge, but they also have versatile weapons out there, so you do have to keep that in mind as well. Secondly, the problem with this is also you have to have line of sight, which doesn't make this as great again as a power, because you need to be able to see your opponent as well. And that's why I kind of think this power is a little bit more situation specific, because if you're trying to stop people from charging you within 9 inches, you got to be able to see them, and that's one of the downsides about this power, especially when you consider that some other abilities in this list don't require line of sight. Power number 2 is also from the Telepathy skill tree. This is Unbreakable Will. It is a basic action to cast, and it also has a continuous effect. The adept channels some measure of the Patriarch's control over nearby cult members. Whenever a nerve or willpower test is made for another fighter from the gang who is within 9 inches of the adept, use the adept's cool or willpower characteristic, whichever is appropriate. Now, for any other gang besides Genestealer Cults, this power would be absolutely amazing. The problem that you run into, of course, is that most Genestealer cultists are already 5+ or 6+ on either their cool or the willpower statistics, so they'll probably pass whatever's coming their way. So that's the only default. That's the only problem with using this ability. However, the adept does have a 5+ willpower, which can be really useful, especially if you're fighting against somebody who's got fearsome skill, or if you're fighting against corpse grinder cults. In which case, that could be really nice because that willpower 6 for most of your Genestealer cultists would drop to 5+. It makes them more likely to be able to attack those kind of opponents as well. Now, if you're playing a Genestealer Corrupted gang, I would suggest this power actually be number 1 because of the ability to transfer willpower and cool stats to fighters whose stats may not be that great. Or if you have other Psykers in the gang, you can build what I like to call the Hive Mind build, where you basically have your Psyker use this ability to get their willpower transferred to other Psykers, who then use your leaders or adepts' willpower to trigger those abilities as well. Kind of creates a cascading effect that kind of exponentially grows the gang's psychic powers off. And if you're making a list like that, that could actually be quite decent. But like I said before, just as it stands out as it is for most Genestealer cultists, it's not as impressive as other powers. Power number 3 is also telepathy power called Zealot. It's a double action to cast. It is a continuous effect, and it says the mere presence of the adept can drive their cult brethren to acts of aggressive hatred. Once per turn, when another fighter from the same gang that is within 9 inches of the adept makes a fight or charge action, any dice of roll of 1, a to hit, may be re-rolled. And this is actually quite a decent buff, especially for your gang, because Genestealer cultists are typically close combat or close quarters battle-oriented type fighters, so you're usually fighting either in close combat or within the 12 to 6 inch range for shooting. The only problem with that ability, though, is that you run the risk of making your adept a close distance fighter as well, and adepts, unfortunately, are not really all that dispossessed to actually fighting in close combat and in close quarters battle. Their characteristics are more about the psychological stats rather than the physical stats, so you kind of put your adept at risk when you do this. There is a trade-off, however, of course. If you pair your adept with your aberrants for your Genestealer Cult gang, or brutes, or some other monstrous fighters that are really strong and powerful, this could be a really great way to destroy your enemies in close combat. But the problem, like I said before, is kind of like a high-risk, high-reward type power because your adept also has to be within close distance. Power number 4 is from the telepathy skill as well. It's called Mind Control. It's a basic action to cast this, and the rules read that twitching and spasming under the control of the adept, an enemy fighter is forced to slowly raise a weapon and take aim upon one of their friends. Select an enemy fighter that's within 9 inches of the adept. That fighter immediately takes a shooting basic action, even if they have already activated this round, targeting an eligible fighter from their gang chosen by the Genestealer Cults player. Now, in my opinion, telepathy's mind control is the best power from this discipline for a couple of reasons. Obviously, having the ability to make your enemy shoot upon their friends is great, especially if that enemy fighter that you select has a really powerful shooting weapon like a flamer or a plasma gun, grenade launcher, or other type of heavy weapon. It's a great way to actually hurt your opponents as well. At the same time, you don't need line of sight to use this ability either. It's anybody within 9 inches, so that's even better. So if your enemy's behind cover, for example, and they have like a really powerful special weapon, like say for a flamer, for example, and they're taking point, they can just turn around and open fire with their flamer on their friends, and that's all kind of fun to do that. The only downside to this power is that you do have to be within 9 inches in order to use this ability, which is quite risky for an adept. Like I said before, adepts are not exactly the greatest close combat fighters or close quarters battle fighters, so you do run that risk of putting your adept within danger by doing that. But if you had to choose one to be the number 1 power, in my opinion, this would be number 1 for sure. Power number 5 is Telekinesis, the Assail basic action. The adept uses this force of their will to push enemies from their path, immediately make a ranged attack against an enemy fighter within 12 inches and line of sight. If hit, the target moves d3 inches in any directions. If they were standing, they become prone and pinned after moving. If they come into base contact with a standing fighter or in any terrain, they stop moving and suffer a strength 3, damage 1 hit. If they come into base contact with another fighter, that fighter also suffers a strength 3, damage 1 hit, and becomes prone and pinned. Now, While this power was not such a great power to use for Chaos Cult Witches, like we talked about those powers, it is decent for Adepts. And the reason why is because Adepts have a 4+ Ballistic skill. So it's just like a normal shooting attack for the most part, and it's also a 12-inch power as well. It's kind of nice because you can pin enemies within 12-inch range. If you can cause a chain reaction of people getting hit and being attacked by this thing, it's even better that way because you can pin multiple enemies, and then of course you can have your fighters come in and charge and attack them. So it is a pretty decent power for what it can do. But the only problem, like I said before, is that you do have to line of sight. You do have to make a ballistic skill check, so that's the reason why it might not be as ideal as other powers. And power number 6 is also for the telekinesis skill tree. It is Force Blast. It's a basic action to cast this ability, and it reads any fighters within 3 inches of the Psyker are immediately pushed D3 + 1 inches away. If this move would push a fighter from a platform or into a pitfall, stop them at the edge and make an initiative test for them. If the test is passed, they are placed prone at the edge. If the test is failed, they will fall. If this movement is interrupted by a wall or other impassable terrain, the fighter is immediately pinned and takes a hit with a strength equal to the number of inches rolled for the distance pushed. Now this is another good defensive power since many of your Adept's abilities are short range, which means that you will be in danger close, and so because of this will help kind of keep the Adept from being assaulted, which is kind of nice as well. Another really great thing about this is that this ability only affects enemy fighters, which is excellent. So if you have other fighters near your Adept, you could use this power to kind of push your enemies away, pin them, have your fighters then countercharge your opponents, go in for the kill, and defeat them that way as well. So that's the reason why it's kind of nice too. Like I said before, unfortunately your Adept is going to be within danger close distance every single time they fight because their powers are such short range, but if you got the countercharge ability like this, it could prove to be a really useful ability. So in conclusion, the Cult Wyrd Powers for Genestealer Cults is a good discipline for Genestealer Cults as well as Genestealer Corrupted Gangs as well. You do have a nice mixture of combat buffs as well as defensive buffs, which does make this this set of weird powers quite attractive as well. And like I said, you will need to create a close combat or a close quarters battle oriented Psyker in order to make the best use of these abilities. Unfortunately, the abilities are incredibly short range within the 9 to 12 inch range, so you got to equip your Adept to be able to deal with threats at that range as well. Give them a really decent close combat weapon, preferably with versatile training around, so that way they can fight multiple times if necessary. Good short range shooting attack that's also powerful. Something like an auto gun with man stopper rounds would be really good to use as well. And make sure you get armor for this fighter and protect them because they are going to be within that distance towards your enemies. Now, if I was to actually rank these powers, it kind of depends on what kind of gang you're playing. If you're playing a Genestealer Cult, pure Genestealer Cult gang, in my opinion, number 1 is going to be Mind Control. That's probably the best power out of this tree, followed by Zealot, just because you're going to be within that close range anyways, followed by Assail as well as Force Blast, finally by Unbreakable Will as well as Hypnosis. And those are actually my picks and how I'd rank them for the Genestealer Cult. But of course, obviously if you play a very different way with your Genestealer Cults, then pick whatever power is best for you because you're the one playing it and not me. Now, if I was to rank this for a Genestealer Corrupted gang, this is actually the abilities I would actually rank him at. I would still rank Mind Control number 1 because it's the most useful of the abilities, followed by Unbreakable Will. This is really good to use, especially if your Genestealer Corrupted gang kind of suffers with their cool as well as willpower characteristics. So for example, if let's say for example you're playing like an Outcast gang, they usually have horrible psychology stats, so Unbreakable Will with your Adept would be a really powerful combination there. I would then go with Zealot, Assail, Force Blast, as well as Hypnosis as well. And once again, that's my ranking for gangs that are corrupted by Genestealer Cults. So there you guys have it. This is our review of the Genestealer Cult Wyrd Powers for your games of Necromunda. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook and Instagram as well as blogger.com for all those greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this channel, you guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.